Welcome to the Innovation Ecosystem Podcast. We interview remarkable and thought-provoking guests about innovation, leadership, and change in the world of business. Whether you're an executive or an entrepreneur, our objective is to help you and your organisation create an entrepreneurial culture, become more innovative, and better able to respond to change. Each week, we'll deconstruct world-class performance from the arenas of business, academia, science, and sports. Each week, you can expect key insights, fresh perspectives, and proven tools you can use straight away to make you more successful professionally and personally. With your host, Mark Bidwell.
Hello, this is Mark Bidwell. Welcome back to the Innovation Ecosystem Podcast. My guest today is Bungay Stanier, who's a leading coaching expert, former Rhodes Scholar, and founder of a Box of Crayons, which is a company that helps managers and leaders coach in 10 minutes or less. And his most recent book, The Coaching Habit, is one of the most practical and compelling books on this important subject that I've read. He really cuts through a lot of the noise around this topic. So in this interview, you're going to learn why coaching can transform not just the person receiving the coaching, but also the huge impact it can have on the coach themselves. So this is a very important capability and one that's pretty widely undervalued in many organizations. And as a consequence, good coaches are really hard to find. He also offers up the best coaching question in the world, as he describes it, the awesome question, which we can all put to use straight away. And he goes on to explain why this simple question is really so powerful. And this is the fascinating part of the conversation. Finally, he gets into the topic of habit, which is one we come back to time and again on this amongst these interviews, and which underpins success in every walk of life. So he really unpacks that concept of habit and weaves it into coaching, hence the name of the book, The Coaching Habit. Before I get started, just to remind you to join the thousands of other business leaders who've chosen to access some of our resources that helps transform themselves and their businesses, making themselves and their businesses more innovative and entrepreneurial. So go to www.innovationecosystem.com. And now let's get straight into the interview. Hello, this is Mark Bidwell from the Innovation Ecosystem. With me today is Bungay Stanier, who is the author of a wonderful book called The Coaching Habit, and also a founder, I think, Michael, is that fair to say, of Box of Crayons?
I think it's very fair to say that I am the founder of Box of Crayons, because I am indeed the founder of Box of Crayons.
Excellent. And Box of Crayons is a company that helps people and organizations all over the world do less good work and more great work.
Yeah, what's perfect about us talking now is that, my background kind of parallels or coalesces nicely with your focus as well. My very first job, I should say, was in the world of innovation and creativity. I invented products and services and tried to make them successful. And when I left that, I moved into helping kind of large-scale change management. And all of that stuff has coalesced in this whole idea of how do you help people do less good work? And by good work, I mean kind of day-to-day, get things done stuff, and more great work. And that's the work that has more impact and the work that has more meaning. So it kind of brings together strategy and innovation and change to try and help the quality of the work being done and the meaningfulness of the work being done at the same time.
And at a very personal level, because the coaching business most of that is one-to-one coaching, I suspect, right?
Well, actually our focus is giving managers the practical tools so they can coach in 10 minutes or less. So it's less about us going in and coaching people and more about, look, coaching is a foundational skill that's just useful for managers and leaders and individual contributors, whether you're going through change, whether you're trying to increase focus, you're trying to increase engagement. So how do you make coaching accessible and useful and practical to people? Because honestly, everybody kind of knows in theory the power of coaching, but in practice, people find it very hard to stay curious, ask great questions, allow the other person to figure stuff out for themselves. And that's the core behavior change that we work on.
So let's unpack that, because 10 minutes is, it's a very, very provocative statement in the sense of, often people get sent on 2 or 3 day long coaching programs. But what has to happen in that 10 minutes for it to be effective? What's the magic? Maybe you can unpack a 10-minute engagement, if you like.
Well, the starting point is from research, which just says when you ask busy managers, so why don't you coach more often? They don't say I'm anti-coaching, and they don't say I don't have the skills, and they don't say many things. What they say is I just don't have time for that.
Okay.
Have you seen my calendar? Have you seen my inbox? Have you seen my meeting requirements? Have you seen all the stuff I have to do? When would I possibly add coaching on top of all of that? So what we started with at Box of Crayons is rather than going, okay, here's Michael's theory about coaching, now I'm going to teach it to people. It was more, why don't managers, and this is the essence of good innovation, right? You start with the customer need, their pain point. Why do managers find it so hard to coach? And the bottom line is two things. One is, I don't have time for that. Secondly, coaching is a bit kind of slightly weird. It's like I've met some coaches. I actually don't want to become a coach. I just want to be a manager doing my job well. So one of the things that we frame up for people is, look, we're not turning you into a coach. We're just helping you be more coach-like so that you can be a more effective leader.
Interesting.
And then when it comes down to it, I mean, a lot of people have absorbed the notion that coaching has to be a kind of long, slightly arduous, slightly weird conversation. Like come into my room.
Yeah, lie down on the couch. Yeah, on the couch. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. We're going to do our monthly coaching session, and honestly, that's just doesn't work very well. Because coaching once a month isn't going to make that much of a difference, and B, everybody's going through these kind of weird motions around, okay, this is different from how we normally work together. Let's coach you now, and then we can go back to being normal after that. So for us, we're just trying to normalize this idea, like coaching is just an everyday way of working with each other, of being with each other. And when it comes down to it, it is simple but difficult. It's simple because actually coaching is simply, how do you stay curious just a little bit longer? How do you rush to action and advice just a little bit slower? It's difficult because people are wired. They've got these deep habits about rushing to action, rushing to giving advice, providing solutions, jumping in with answers. And trying to slow down that rush, that pattern of behavior is actually quite difficult.
So it's slowing down to speed up in terms of productivity, essentially.
Yeah. So the way I try and get people interested in this is I say, look, let me show you how to work less hard, but have more impact. And one of the three core principles we talk about when we teach coaching are be lazy, be curious, be often. And of course, again, be lazy I have a bit of a marketing background, so you can tell in some of my language, it's designed to be provocative because I want people to stop and go, wait, what does that mean? And be lazy is one of those words because everyone's like, what do you mean be lazy? Do you not know how hard I'm working? And I'm like, I do know how hard you're working. And how's that going for you? The answer is it's not going that well. You're actually overwhelmed. You've got too much on. You've got emails that date back to 1998 that you haven't answered yet. And no matter how up to date you are on the latest productivity hacks, no matter which app you've recently downloaded for your gadget, you're never going to get on top of this stuff. What you actually need to do is actually go, let me work less hard. Let me allow them to do the work so that I can actually help them and myself have more impact in the work that I do.
I mean, it reminds me of David Allen, who I know has written very positively about your latest book, and I did want to ask about why he wants, I think he wants to have, he's the one person he'd recommend to have dinner with. But David was on an earlier show, and what David talks about is, he's essentially a lazy person by his own admission. So he wanted to set up processes that enable him to be more effective. And you're essentially doing the same thing, but getting the individual, the coachee, to do the work, essentially.
Exactly. So this is not to say never give advice to anybody. It's not to say never offer help to anybody. It is to say slow down the rush to give advice, because often if you can just ask a good question, A, they're going to figure it out. B, they'll figure it out for themselves. B, they'll own the answer, so it'll be more kind of likely to be acted upon. And the other key insight to take around this is that we're so tempted to, when we identify a problem, to rush in and start fixing it. But almost always the first challenge that shows up is actually not the real challenge. So here's what starts happening. A, you're solving the wrong problem. B, you're solving it instead of the person you're trying to coach and support is solving it. C, honestly, the advice you have isn't nearly as good as you actually think it is. So it boils down to, okay, so I'm solving the wrong problem with not very good advice, and I'm doing the work for somebody else. How does that equate to good leadership? The answer is it doesn't really.
Yeah.
What's great is I think coaching is part of the solution to trying to change that dynamic.
And so I mean, and in this lovely book that you've written, The Coaching Habit, I mean, the subtitle says it all really: say less, ask more, and change the way you lead forever. I mean, you go through seven habits and 7 questions a question relating to each of those habits. And you've touched on a number of them already. But I mean, if you were to, so let's say we've got 10 minutes and you've spent the first 6 or 7 minutes explaining why it's okay to be a coach to a senior manager. What's the next step in terms of giving them the tools that they need in order to be effective and to transform? I suppose it's almost like their mindset, isn't it, of what it means to be a manager or a leader?
Well, part of it's a mindset, and part of that is, I can't talk you into wanting to be a coach. That just never works. I've got to kind of point to somewhere where you're struggling and going, let me help you fix that. So that's why we tend to say, rather than let me teach you coaching, we tend to say, hey, let me show you how to work less hard and have more impact. And if you say to lots of managers, I'm going to teach you how to coach, they're like, oh, okay, if you must. It sounds like an HR initiative to me. If I say, hey, let me show you how to work less hard but have more impact, that's a more interesting conversation right away.
Yep.
So helping them feel that is important. And in the book, I think the little piece that really drives people around that is a piece around the drama triangle, which we can talk about a bit later if that's useful. Then I'm like, okay, so the reason the first chapter of the book is not about coaching, and it's not about questions, and it's not about how to ask questions, and it's not one of the 7 essential questions. It's actually about habit building, because what we're trying to do here is get people to actually change the way they behave. And if you don't understand how habits work, you're up against it, because habits are the building blocks of behavior change. So it's like, let me show you how to figure that out. And then once you know what the mechanics of doing things differently are, you can decide which questions or what behaviors you want to layer in to build new habits around. And, and in the book, as you say, we offer 7 questions. They're all pretty good. You don't have to do all 7 questions. It's like, where I would say is like, pick the one that feels most useful and start there and figure out how to build that into a habit.
Yeah. And the habit, I mean, I guess this draws on the book by The Power of Habit, which I think you refer to either in this book or somewhere else. But I mean, how does that resonate? Because I mean, it's so simple, but it's not easy, that concept. I mean, how do people's eyes light up when they hear about habits? Because I suppose people have, is it possible they're thinking about what else can be transformed by this methodology beyond their leadership role?
Oh, for sure. So, there's a lot out there, an embarrassing large amount out there, which is just terrible advice on how to change your habits. The classic one that always makes me laugh / bang my head against the wall is this whole idea of, if you do it for 21 days, it becomes a habit. Yeah.
Well, that's slightly less than 10,000. Well, 10,000 hours is mastery, I suppose, but it's similar kind of, people roll their eyeballs at that time length, don't they?
Yeah, and everybody wants to believe that if I just did it for 21 days, it would become a habit. But we all kind of know that, in our lives, for some reason, that doesn't work. And actually, I found out the origin of that fairly recently. The origin of the 21 days thing comes from the early days of plastic surgery, when a plastic surgeon noticed it took about 3 weeks for somebody to get used to their new nose after it had been operated on. And somehow that's become translated into, if you do it for 21 days, it becomes a habit. So it's completely wrong. Yeah. But as you say, we draw on the Charles Duhigg book, The Power of Habit, which is very good, and some other habit kind of gurus, if you like. BJ Fogg, who's got a great website called Tiny Habits. Leo Babauta, who's got a wonderful blog called Zen Habits.
Yeah, it's a lovely
books around that.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that. It's great, isn't it?
He's terrific. The other guy I love is Dan Coyle, who wrote The Talent Code. It's also a really insightful book. Anyway, we pulling on all of these smart people, we came up with a very simple formula. It's called the New Habit Formula, and it's got 3 parts to it. And here are the 3 parts. Part 1 is the phrase, when this happens. And when this happens, what you're doing is you're identifying the trigger, the context, the situation where the behavior or the old habit starts. And that's really important. I mean, that's really drawing on Charles Duhigg and others going, if you don't understand the trigger, you'll never change your habits, because if you don't know what the trigger is, you're already into the habit before you know what's happening, because it's an unconscious trigger. Then the second part of the new habit formula is instead of. And instead of means when you identify and you kind of own up to the old habit, the bad habit that you're looking to change now. And then the third step is the phrase, I will in 60 seconds or less. And that's when you identify the new habit, but then it's really a tangible, tactical habit. It's one that you can complete in 60 seconds or less. And this comes from B.J. Fogg's work, where he says, look, if you make a habit any bigger than that, basically your big smart brain and the power of the status quo will collude to never quite getting around to doing that. And you know what this is like. You know, you're like, okay, going to get fit again. I was an athlete in my prime. I'm going to refine that because now I'm just a soft, lumpy, middle-aged man. I mean, I'm speaking for myself, not for you, Mark, obviously. So I'm going to start running again in the morning because I like running and I was good at it my time. I'm going to start running. So you go to bed that night. The alarm goes at 6 o'clock the next morning. And as you lie there under your duvet, your blanket, whatever, you think to yourself, well, I'm not going to go running this morning, obviously, but the next morning, definitely I'm going to go running. And, you know, your bold intention of I'm going to build a habit to run every morning gets kind of sidestepped.
Yeah.
Now, what B.J. Fogg would suggest you do is something like, you know, define it as a 60-second habit. It could sound something like this. When the alarm goes, I'm going to get out of bed and put on my running shoes and maybe step out the door. There we go. So a few quick things, get out of bed, put on my running shoes, step out the door. And you're not committing to going for a run. You're not committing to running every morning. You're not doing any of that. You're committing to the 60-second habit, like the micro habit. That is the first step in getting something going. Mm-hmm. And in some ways, this draws upon David Allen's work, who you referenced before. Because, you know, in getting things done, one of the things that David says is you can't do a project. You can only do the next action. And one of the things I think is very clever and sometimes gets overlooked at getting things done is part of the secret of building momentum, of stopping procrastinating, is to figure out what the next action is that just gets a little bit of momentum going. And it's similar with the B.J. Fogg insight. Mm-hmm,
mm-hmm. Yeah. One of the things that strikes me about that is missing, though, is the congratulation, because I don't think we're all, well, I don't want to speak for you, but I mean, typically we tend to be sort of high achievers and we're quite hard on ourselves. And and the idea...
Just to interrupt for a moment, you're like, okay, I'm a high achiever, but Michael, I don't want to speak for you. You're probably not a high achiever. Man, this is a harsh podcast. No, keep going.
I'm trying not to put words.
Pick a man when he's down. No?
But my point, as I'm sure you know very well, Michael, was we're not wired to actually congratulate ourselves and to create some kind of positive emotional feedback loop associated with just putting on your shoes and going out the front door, because we all, if you're able to do that sort of, I suppose, what would that do? It strengthens the neural pathways. It strengthens your ability to, actually, that was worth it. I got something out of it. So maybe tomorrow I might actually even go down the street to the end of the road, for instance.
Well, that's the other piece that you can look back on the Charles Duhigg piece. So he talks about the habit loop. And for him, the habit loop has three parts to it. It's the trigger, and the behavior, and then the reward. Mm-hmm. And the reward, it's that little rush of dopamine in the brain that makes your brain go, that's good, you should do that again next time. And one of the interesting variations on this is, if people are really interested in this, there's a guy called Nir Eyal. So it's an unusual name. Its first name is Nir, N-I-R. Mm-hmm. Second name is Eyal, E-Y-A-L. Yep. And his book is called Hooked. And it's actually about how do these evil geniuses in Silicon Valley create apps and gadgets and make us want to keep checking them. And he talks about the power of variable reward. That's why we love to check our gadget when we hear that ping, the trigger from the email. We're like, oh, maybe somebody loves me. That's the reward we're looking for. And when we don't get it, we crave it a little bit more. But in terms of building your own habits, that whole idea of, acknowledging success, finding the reward. So when you get up in the morning, you put on your shoes, you step out the door, what you do is just for 10 seconds, hold your hands in the air like you're crossing the victory line, go, yes, I made it out the door. And what you're doing is you're giving yourself that little shot of dopamine. You're wiring your brain to go, yeah, this is a rewarding behavior. I should do it again next time.
Yeah, lovely. So for the entrepreneur, I'd say, or the manager sitting in their organization, wanting to, recognizing, listening to this and thinking, yeah, okay, I've got to get on top of this coaching. I've got to start becoming more effective, having greater impact with, and enjoying myself without working quite so hard. What are there are 7 habits here. What are there any? I'm going to trying to boil it down even to. I mean, are there any? Is there a lead domino here? Is there something that really moves the needle? It's a one skill that someone can in 60 seconds sort of, build some awareness of and get a couple of tactics to help embed that skill of the 7 habits in the book?
Well, look, the essence of the book are the 7 questions, and then built around each of the 7 questions are 7 sort of smart ways, masterclasses to ask a question well, so that once you've figured out what the right question is, how do you deliver it in a way that lands, that works, that gives you the best chance of success? My suggestion is, rather than start with how to ask the question well, it's pick a question.
Yep.
So now which question to pick? Well, that's the tricky one. It's like, honestly, this book took me about 3 or 4 years to write. It almost killed me because I kept writing bad versions of it before I wrote a good version.
Really?
And, I wrote one with I think 169 questions in it, one with 5 questions, one with 9. I mean, that whole insight about innovation and building an innovation ecosystem is part of it is about iterations and rapid iterations, because your first solution is not going to be the right solution. And honestly, this tested my innovation capacity, which is like, oh my God, how many variations of this book am I going to write before the right one shows up?
And I'm curious, in that process, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I mean, how did you sustain? Because I'm going to recover from my earlier comment. You're a very successful, accomplished person. And my opening question was going to be, and my opening question, Michael, was going to be about being a Rhodes Scholar, which we won't go into now. But clearly, that set you up very nicely for because you've got plenty of very successful Rhodes Scholars in the world today or historically. But my question, I suppose, is a bit more. How did you maintain the momentum and the resilience to keep going? Because when most people would say, okay, well, my version 4, I've got 9 questions. That's it. That's a wrap. Let's go on to the next thing. I mean, take me through your mindset that enabled you to find the strength to continue, if you like.
Well, the first part was actually the fact that I was sending out versions of my book to my friends or to my agent or to my publisher, and they were telling me this is not a very good book. So there's a certain amount of okay, I'm actually getting feedback from the world that I haven't cracked it yet, which is really annoying, because with all my other books that I've written, pretty much the first version of it turned out to be a good enough version and people liked it. So I was kind of thinking I'd sort of sorted out how to write a book.
Well, maybe you needed to change your agent. Maybe you were thinking, right?
Exactly. And honestly, there were times where I was like, okay, do I want to keep trying to write this book? Because, writing a book is a miserable experience. I mean, you sweat through a first draft, and of course the first draft is terrible. So you sweat through a second draft and it's not much better. And then you write a 9th draft, and at this stage it's a little bit better, but you hate yourself and you hate the book. So, when people come to me and go, Mike, I'm thinking of writing a book, I tend to go, are you sure? Because it's a hard way to get an idea or two out into the world. It can be powerful, but honestly, most books are read by very few people. Yep. So it's just the best way to do this. But 2 things kind of pulled me forward. The one is I knew this book played a bigger goal. So, talking about Leo Babauta, and he got a book called Zen Habits, same name as his blog. And one of the things that Leo talks about in his book about how to build a habit is he calls it having a vow. In other words, who are you serving and how does this serve a bigger purpose, this habit, this thing you're trying to build? In his context is, I'm giving up smoking for my wife and my children. for me, I knew this book could be a key part of the Box of Crayons ecosystem. We sell training programs about practical coaching skills. I knew that if this was a good book and it took off, it would not only be a tool that we could use in the programs, but be a marketing tool to attract people to ask about the programs. So it had a kind of strategic reason around it as well. But honestly, you can talk yourself out of that if need be. You can go, oh, there's other ways for me to do that. The truth is, it kept showing up as, you need to write this book. And then, I spent 2 years basically trying to pitch it to my previous New York publishing company and through an agent and the like, and I just couldn't get traction with them. So part of what kept me going was trying to remember the core of what I really saw in this book, because I had a really kind of good vision for it, even if I couldn't execute on the vision. And then at a certain point saying to my agent or my publisher, look, either you go with this vision or I go off on my own. But I can't be doing what we're doing at the moment, where I come back with an idea or an approach and they go, no, well, look, we love it. We just don't love it. So not this, but something else. Go off and do something else. And I just got kind of suckered into this kind of perpetual play of trying to figure out what they were thinking of, even though they weren't really thinking of anything. So I just went, okay, I'm up for this. I'm going to do this myself if you're not going to do it. They came back and said no. And so I was like, okay, well, I'm going to do it myself. And I really committed to getting the best people around me to help with that. So I hired Seth Godin, who I know a little bit. He introduced me to his editor, and she turned out to be brilliant. We found an award-winning Canadian designer who turned out to be brilliant. He introduced me to a wonderful publishing team called Page 2 Strategies, who are really fantastic at helping independents bring their book to market. So we just built this really strong team, and that was lighting the fuse. That was the thing that made all the difference.
Lovely. And maybe we can follow up, because I've got a book project underway at the moment, but now's not the time to go into it, I think. Right. I might get a bit too depressed on it. But just going back to the question, Michael, about around for the manager trying to get on top of coaching. I think you said, which question, it starts with landing on a question. I mean, I look at some of them here, what's on your mind? What was the real challenge? How should people think about that if they're listening in that context?
Okay, so if I was like, okay, if I had to get you to pick one question, I'd get you to pick the second question in the book. And we call that the best coaching question in the world. So you can guess now why I'm suggesting it. Because it's simple and it's powerful. And it's very strongly connected to the whole idea of innovation as well. And the question is simply, and what else? AWE is the acronym. So it's literally an awesome question. And what else is powerful because it recognizes that the first answer somebody gives you is never the only answer, and it's rarely the best answer. And the second reason and what else is so powerful is it's a self-management tool, because it stops that part of you, that twitching, helpful, let me jump in and fix it and solve it and rescue the situation. It slows that part down, because if you're asking and what else, if you're staying curious, you're not jumping in and fixing things. So in other words, and what else helps you stay lazy. And it's perfectly connected and aligned with this whole framework you got around innovation, which is, innovation in part is about how do we generate better options? What are the alternative? What are our choices? And what else is the simplest way to generate new ideas and new options as well?
And as you say that, I mean, if I think of the senior execs I've worked with in the past, that's not a question that you hear coming out of many execs at the top of their business, at the top of their careers, because I guess for the reason that it's an open question. It's not a question that enables them to demonstrate how good they are at what they've done, and but on the other hand, that's exactly why it's so powerful, I suspect.
Well, your insight's a really great one, Mark, because when people ask me, so why is it so hard for people to ask a good question? Why don't people coach more often? And I'm like, well, part of it's just habit. They've spent a career being praised for giving advice, having an answer, coming up with a solution. But there's part of it kind of connects to that reward part of the habit loop, which is, so what's the reward in doing that? And here's the insight. Even though your advice isn't nearly as good as you think it is, and even though you may well be solving the wrong problem just because you think the first problem is the real problem, and it typically isn't, even though all of those are true, so you're not being that effective, it kind of feels pretty good to give somebody advice because, look, it establishes you as the smartest person in the room. It allows you to feel that you're adding value. It means that you have the status, that, you know, the high status in the conversation, which makes you feel happier. It means that you're in control of this conversation. And the alternative is to ask a question. And when you ask a question, a couple of things are happening. First of all, as soon as you ask it, you're now in a place of ambiguity. Was that a good question? Was that the right question? What answer are they going to come up with? What if they come up with some crazy ass answer that I don't even know how to respond to? You know, where's this conversation going? How will this end? And, you know, what you've done is you have empowered the other person. You've given them control of the conversation. And of course, everybody nods their head and goes, yeah, I'm really pro-empowerment. Empowerment, it's a good thing. But empowerment means giving up power so that the other person has it. And actually, people are pretty reluctant to give up power, to give up control, because it feels comfortable. It's like a nice warm cloak around our shoulders. So just relating this back to your piece around, you don't hear this question very often. It's not just a senior executive's fault. You know, it's a system that's built this up, which is like, you feel good because you're giving advice. They feel good because, look, they've gone to somebody else and got advice. And, you know, who's going to get fired for following the advice of their boss's boss? Nobody, right? Yeah. So it's like everyone's colluding to pretend that this works. The challenge is it doesn't always work. It works far less than people might think.
It's essentially an institution-wide habit versus a personal habit, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly right.
And then, okay, so changing gears a little bit, as you said earlier on, I mean, you worked for a couple of, I think you worked for What If and then another consulting firm and then founded Box of Crayons. So in the 15, 16 years of doing this kind of work, I mean, what are you seeing anything, I mean, are you seeing anything around how leaders lead to create cultures of innovation in your client base? I just wonder, can is there a before and after story here based on either the impact that you and your team have had or based on, innovation and, leadership styles evolving to take account of the new commercial realities of doing business today?
Well, when I started working with What If, so that was, 20 years ago, innovation was really not much of a buzzword at the time. I remember going into clients and we kind of had to explain what innovation was. It was really kind of what do they call it? The Precambrian explosion of innovation that's happened since then. Now it's kind of, every organization goes, oh, innovation, it's part of our DNA. We need to make it part of the way that we work. And it is hard to inculcate an innovation culture because, for me, I draw on a guy called Ed Schein, Schein, who's really, for me, the guy who thinks usefully about corporate cultures. And the summary of his model would be there are three layers to corporate culture. There's the artifacts. That's the stuff you look around and see, everything from the color of the walls to the way people dress to the org chart to the type of titles people have to all of that sort of stuff. Anything that you can kind of see or point to, that's the artifacts. Then there are the espoused values. It's what people talk about as what matters in this company, in this organization. And then there are, at the kind of deepest level, the unspoken assumptions. That's kind of the habits of the company. That's the way that we operate around here. And when you have all three of those levels aligned, you have a very powerful culture. More typically, though, you have the first two that coalesce around something, and then you have the deeper habits that are actually not quite aligned with that. So, it's the classic is we're a people first company. And look, we've got pictures of employee of the month on the wall, and the CEO stands up and she talks about we're an employee first company. But the decisions are basically made around how do we make money around here. And so classic innovation, it's like, no, we love innovation. Innovation is in our lifeblood. And look, we have orange walls and bean bags. That's how innovative we are. But then you go and you sit in a meeting, and the meeting is run in the standard way, and there's no rewards for breaking the rules, and you don't celebrate failure, and blah, 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 all the things that are what behaviors look like for an innovation, a culture that has innovation built into it. And that's not a strong innovation culture. So I think the seduction always is to go with the first two levels. And the hard work is to actually think about how do we change the way we behave around here so that we have that foundation, that habitual way of thinking and behaving in an innovative way. And that's tricky, and it's as hard now as it was 20 years ago.
Yeah. And you touched on meetings, which are, I think meetings are such a fascinating, lever to pull if you want to change an organization's culture, because, A, most people spend most of their lives in meetings, and B, most of them are so terribly organized and run, and the experience is so unpleasant. Again, let's go back to the sort of, the manager of a team trying to recognizing that his team isn't necessarily creative enough or innovative enough. Any tips on how could he or she run a meeting that fosters more engagement, more which brings to life perhaps some of the tools, some of the questions. What would good look like for that individual?
Look, let me offer up some just generic answers, because obviously it depends on the person, on the team, on the culture. Are they remote? Are they in the same room? All that sort of stuff. But if I was looking to kind of disrupt how the meetings happen at the moment, the first thing I'd do is let's halve the amount of time we have for this meeting. Because, any meeting expands to fill the time allotted to it. Yep. So it's like, okay, if you've only got half an hour instead of an hour, notice that creates a certain degree of urgency. So increase, hopefully, a sense of where do we focus. The second thing I'd be doing is cull anybody who doesn't need to be there. Because meetings tend to be bloated with a whole bunch of people who are like, I don't know why I'm here. There's nothing much of value for me here. I'm not contributing. I'm not learning. I'm kind of doing my email under the table while the meeting goes on. So it's like cut the people who don't need to be there. And then thirdly, I might think about how do you frame the agenda around a question? So rather than we're talking about the marketing campaign, and there's a kind of now long report out about all the stuff that's happened, boring, and there's 1,000 better ways to share information than that. What I think every agenda item should have is, what's the question we're seeking to answer here? And if there's not a question to answer, it shouldn't be on the agenda. Yep. And once you have a question to answer, you then get to play around with, is this the right challenge? That connects with one of the questions in the book. What's the real challenge here for you? You can generate options, and what else, and what else. You can ask them kind of really challenging questions. So what do we want? What do you want here? Really trying to find the purpose, the vision behind that. And you can use any number of the questions from the book to kind of drive a deeper conversation. But the starting point is to go, what's the question we're looking to tackle here in this meeting?
No, lovely. I mean, it's that wasn't a leading question, but as you say that, I can see the power of this approach in all sorts of interactions with individuals and with groups.
Right.
Yeah, fascinating. And Michael, I mean, you referred earlier on to a number of resources you used in creating the book. Any resources that you've come across that actually dig into the subject of meetings in more detail, that really kind of unlock some of the challenges that so many people face in the corporate world at the moment?
Yeah, there's a book out there. So about 5 years ago, I published a book in partnership with Seth Godin. Seth had a year of I'm publishing books. He created his own publishing house, and he set it up in partnership with Amazon. So these books were only published through Amazon. And I put out a book called End Malaria. It was a philanthropic project. So we raised about $400,000 for Malaria No More through this kind of anthology of essays from various thought leaders like David Allen and other people like that.
And the proceeds of your book go to go to Embellera as well. The proceeds of Coaching Habit, right?
No,
they don't.
The proceeds of that go to me.
Okay, all right. Forgive me.
we do make a donation to the Nature Conservancy of Canada, but with the end malaria, all of the money went to Malaria No More.
Super.
Now, at the same year, Seth put out a book by a guy called Al, and his surname starts with P, but it's quite a complicated surname, and I can't remember it. And I think the book is something called "Read This Before Your Next Meeting." So
I think I know the book. I'll dig it out because I think I've got a copy of it.
It's like Al Pirampali or something like that. I just don't want to kind of get Al's name too wrong. And the book is, I think, called "Read This Before Your Next Meeting," and I think there's a lot in there that it's just good practical sense to go, how do we make these meetings much stronger than they currently are?
Yeah, super. So beginning to wrap up here, because this has been very, very helpful. Firstly, I sent some questions through to you beforehand, Michael. First one, what have you changed your mind about recently?
That doing this podcast with you was a good idea. I've definitely no, sorry, that'd be a facetious answer. So I sat with that question for a while, and I can't think of anything where I've radically changed my mind about something, and maybe that's just as a reflection that I'm not a man of strong opinions, or maybe I'm kidding myself. But one of the things that I'm constantly trying to change my mind about, so it's an ongoing process, is I'm far less important than I think I am. And, that resonates in terms of how I show up in my own company and the role I play in my own company and how much I trust other people and how much I delegate and hand over to other people. And it also shows up in kind of holding the work I do as both really important, but also lightly as well. I mean, in 100 years' time, the very few people who've heard of me now will all be dead. Nobody will remember my name. My work will most likely be completely unknown to anybody. So rather than that depressing me, it's actually a thought of going, so that means you can do anything you want because nobody's going to remember it anyway. So why not be courageous and bold and really go for something that you think, this is the best version of myself that I can put out there through my work?
Interesting. Yeah, I was going to follow up with the question, so what is the real challenge? But I think perhaps we don't have time for that, right?
Right, but I know where you're going with that. Yeah.
So I've read the book. So next question, what do you do to remain creative and innovative?
Well, three things came to mind. First of all, is I read a lot. So I read broadly. I read in different disciplines. I'm reading Kevin Kelly's book at the moment called The Inevitable.
Yeah, he was on our show a few weeks ago. He's an amazing guy.
He is an amazing guy, and his book is mind-blowing. I love that. And I read in science, and I read business, and I read a lot of fiction. So just reading broadly, I think, can be really powerful. Secondly, is I use pen and paper quite a bit. So there's something about the freedom of pen and paper, about drawing options, drawing possibilities. I don't know if do you know Dan Rome? Have you come across him?
Yes, I do. Yeah, the back of the napkin.
Exactly. And he's got a brand new book out now or in the next little while. He'd be another great guest for this podcast, actually, because I do think drawing and sketching and playing around with stuff really helps the creativity piece. And then the third piece is just coming back to that and what else question, which is I ask myself that question. Okay, good. And what else could I do here? And that just forces me to generate new ideas and new possibilities. Yeah.
So a bonus question, seeing as it's not on the schedule, but I mean, you obviously, you are having an impact with your work. That's clear. You've done a great work for Malaria as well. And what else for Michael? I mean, what are your plans beyond what you're doing at the moment?
Well, as I think about what we have done at Box of Crayons, from my very first book called Get Unstuck and Get Going, and the coaching habit and the programs we do, a big part of what we appear to be committed to is this kind of slightly disrupting the expectation of what coaching is and making it accessible in a way of working for all sorts of people. So one of the ways, at the moment we do that through our programs and doing it through our books. But we're now looking at other ways to reach out, to kind of connect with people, to make coaching feel like an everyday accessible practice that they could actually start doing, rather than keeping it in the hands of, just professional coaches or just people who've got that coach label. So we're still playing around with what that could actually look like, but that's kind of the destination that we're looking for. And then the other piece connected with that in some ways is, we mostly serve corporations and organizations at the moment, but we're trying to figure out how to bring some of these tools into the world of education in a way that can best serve, principals and superintendents and teachers and students as well.
Lovely. Yeah. Very, very relevant, very relevant. Then the final question, which I did send you in advance, to what do you attribute your success in life? And are there any specific skills or habits or mindsets that you've mastered, do you think that have had a major significant impact?
I put it down almost entirely to my extreme good looks. I mean, when you have a face like mine, it's almost impossible not to succeed. So what would I put it down to? Okay, I'd say this, three things. One is a certain degree of not taking myself too seriously, because it's, everybody calm down. I'm doing the best I can. But so a sense of humor and maybe a sense of humility around some of this. Part of it is around just a resilience, like a willingness to show up. I mean, for instance, I'm a Rhodes Scholar, as you mentioned, but not many people know that I actually applied to be a Rhodes Scholar the 2 years before I actually was awarded it, and I got roundly rejected. I didn't even make the first round interviews, which I was told everybody gets a first interview, and then I didn't get a first interview. But rather than kind of taking that as a no, I took it as okay, so is it worth getting back on that horse? And, likewise writing the book. How do you keep going if you think it's important? So I think resilience, a sense of humor, and I think part of it is around a willingness to try and think about, what is the impact I want to have in this world? So it's not enough just to go through the motions. I'm looking to have the best impact I possibly can in the very small time I'm around on this planet. So I try and be ambitious about the work I'm trying to do.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And it comes through, because I think, as I said earlier on, I mean, at one level, the book it's about coaching, but it's about far more than that. It's about having a significant impact through others, in service of others.
Yeah, I love you said that. Thank you.
No, it's fantastic. So where can people get in touch with you, Michael?
Well, I'm going to give two potential sources on the web. If you're interested in more about the book, then simply thecoachinghabit.com. And even if you're not interested in the book, but you just want to kind of pillage it for free videos and downloads and stuff, there's a lot there. You can download the first chapter or two. If you're interested in the programs, then boxofcrayons.biz, B-I-Z or B-I-Z, depending on where you are in the world, is another place to go. And if you're looking to connect with me personally in social media, the place I hang out most often is LinkedIn. So I am the only Michael Bungay Stanier, not only in the universe, but also on LinkedIn. So you can find me there.
And we'll put all that in the show notes, and if there's any handouts or anything that we can put in there as well, we'll put that up. I mean, it's been a real great pleasure to have you on the show, Michael. I really do appreciate it, and thank you very much for your time and for putting me on the spot a couple of times, which is keeps me on my toes. And I'm sure our audience will have enjoyed it as much as I did. We'll put the information out there once we're up with the show, in terms of we've got a launch date. But many thanks for your time.
Mark, it's been a real pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Okay, bye. Hi, this is Mark again. I love the simplicity and elegance of his approach, this 10-minute promise that he can take people and help them become better coaches. But of course, simple isn't easy. So the section on how to build and maintain habits in an instant as well, rather than over the 21 days that conventionally seems to be the thought around how long did it take to build a new habit, was very, very powerful, compelling. And again, this is the key enabler to being a good coach, to being a good manager, to being a good entrepreneur, to being a good innovator. Finally, some other great resources that he referred to on the show, which we'll put in the show notes. I was particularly interested in a previous guest, David Allen, of Getting Things Done, and the relationship that he and Michael have, and Michael's insights on why is it that David's approach around what's the next action is so powerful and so profound in helping people build momentum. So plenty in here, lots of knowledge, but of course knowledge is not power, it's only potential power. So I do urge you to take action. This book is very, very easy to access. The questions are very easy. And as I say, Michael's promise and that of his company is to in 10 minutes to train people to become better coaches, and suggest you start with looking in the show notes and going onto their site to understand what they do. Pick up a copy of the book, perhaps be in touch with them. They do have resources which you can access to help you on this journey. But this is a very, very important topic for any of us who are interested in making ourselves and our organisations more innovative, more entrepreneurial. Hop over to our site to grab some additional resources, leave a review. Until next week, have a great time.